I'll just give it 2 more minutes or 2 more seconds, actually. Okay. Cool. All right, thanks everyone. Well, welcome to today's Third Thursday. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we move into the event. First of all, we're obviously broadcasting through Zoom, which has a tendency to occasionally have issues, or your internet might cut out, or we might have disturbances. If you've got any problems at all with your connection or video, we are also broadcasting live on the CPC website. So if you post in the chat you're having problems, we'll make sure the link's in there and you can get through. So today's event is all about digitising the future of environmental impact assessments. And it's something we at the Catapult have been looking at for the last 6 months or so as part of a collaborative project funded by Innovate. So we'll be talking a bit about that today. And Liam will explain more in his presentation, but just think about today's situation of environmental impact assessments as a lorry delivering piles and piles of A4 folders of paper. And today we've got presentations from 3 great speakers. So first of all, we've got Liam, who is from CPC, and he's one of our service designers that's going to be talking about the discovery we've been doing over the last 6 months. And then we have Pauline from Scottish Renewables, who we're really lucky to have because they are actually testing an approach to a digital EIA on a real life project. And then we've got Alistair Parvin from Open Systems Lab, who are doing really interesting things across the whole planning sphere around digitisation of planning. Following the presentations from the speakers, we're going to take questions from the audience. And Alistair Walker from Quod, who are a major EIA consultant and one of our partners on our own digital EIA project, is going to join for that, as well as Dominica, who is a service designer on the project. Just so you guys note, when you do question and answer, please use the question and answer function rather than the chat, and Dominica will be reviewing those as we go along just to make sure we're capturing your questions. We might not get through all of the questions on the call because we've only got 15 minutes, and we might find that we're paraphrasing some of the things you say if there are 5 that are very similar. But if we don't cover them all, we will try and either answer them after this event, or we'll do a separate Q&A briefing. And then finally, just to let you know, this event's being recorded and a live stream will be available following it. So over now to our first speaker.
Hello, I'm Liam, a service designer at the Catapult. I'm just going to share my screen to get up the presentation for me. Okay, great. So, yes, I'm Liam, a service designer at the Connected Places Catapult on the Insight and Service Design team. So we use a little bit about our team. We use a human-centered design approach and apply our research and design skills to understand an important combination of the outside perspectives and inside expertise to uncover unique insights which inform designs for our new and improved products and services. And we work across projects all across the Catapult. So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of some of the work that we've done and the insights that we've collected on the EIA project. I do want to have 10 minutes, so make sure to check out the full report, which you can find at the website in the top right-hand corner. Yes, so I'll make a start. So before I kind of go into it too much, just in case we have anyone in the audience who doesn't quite know what an EIA is, put simply, it is the job of an environmental impact assessment to evaluate the environmental and social impacts that a large development might have on an area, and then communicate these impacts to developers, deciding bodies such as local authorities and their consultees. I've tried to stay clear of using too much jargon, but feel free to ask Dominica in the chat if there's anything that you need explaining or if you have any questions throughout. So our partners on the project were Quod and Temple, who are both EIA consultants. We also had ODI leads from the Open Data Institute, and also Liquorice. And our consortium of partners, I think, placed us in quite a unique position because it meant that we were able to look at the challenge from a mixture of inside and outside perspectives without being funded by a particular commercial organization hoping to achieve financial gain. So we're a multidisciplinary team as well. So we're made up of expertise in areas such as planning, environmental impact assessments, data, user research, service design, user interface design, and marketing. So back in October last year, we were challenged by Innovate UK to explore a future vision for how a better designed, data-informed, and digitally driven environmental impact assessment process might be beneficial for developers, planners, and the community at large. Human-centered design techniques are at the heart of the project. And by conducting user research and workshops with relevant stakeholders, we were able to gain an in-depth understanding, we hope, of the EIA process, as well as the challenges and pain points throughout. So it means that our insights are based on evidence, and hopefully the ideas we've developed, the kind of high-level ideas, are grounded in kind of research. So speaking with experts allowed us to understand that there are kind of pretty much three primary stakeholder groups involved in the process. So you have producers, which include EIA consultants and specialists, for example, reviewers, such as local authorities, consultees, general public, and also proposers, such as developers and major infrastructure providers. But before we started to think about potential solutions and kind of go into the kind of nitty gritty too much, we needed to kind of take a step back for a second, look at the brief that we were given by Innovate UK. And we needed to ask why, you know, like we needed to ask, why is it important? Why do EIAs exist? Why do they need to be better designed? And we took these kind of questions to the interviews that we did. And this is kind of something that we heard. In an ideal world, all new developments would have a positive impact on the environment, not just a reduced negative impact. Making the process more efficient and effective would give us more time and power to do this. So it kind of allowed us to have a utopia to aim for. And it also meant that we should definitely consider the planet as one of our stakeholders too. So I'm going to jump into the challenges that we found within the current EIA process. So the first one we found was that self-regulation is leading to an obesity crisis. So we heard that from a lot of stakeholders, the term obesity crisis, and they were referring to the unnecessary length and complexity of reports, but also the sheer volumes of data. For example, the environmental statement for HS2 was 49,000 pages long. And these reports, as Kate said, can sometimes be delivered by lorries or vans in stacks of boxes to local authorities. Current environmental statement formats do not enable high quality community engagement. So navigating through an environmental statement can be tricky. Sometimes relevant information can be hidden across various documents. And the language used is often full of acronyms and jargon. Access to valid data is restricted, so it can be really hard to find data, and the data standards are often inconsistent, or the data is often hidden away in PDFs or Word documents. Today's EIA is undervalued as a key tool to inform design, so often the environmental statement, which is kind of the outcome of one of the outcomes of the EIA process, is seen as the only outcome, and it isn't recognized as an iterative process to inform the design of developments. And it can also sometimes be seen as burdensome and costly. And then there's also a lack of post-application evaluation and monitoring, which was kind of a big one for us. Data about the actual impact of developments is rarely collected, which makes it impossible to know whether the predictions and mitigations, recommendations in environmental impact assessments were actually effective or not. And the kind of lack of monitoring can often be driven by a lack of clarity around who is responsible for doing that. Based on the challenges, we identified opportunity areas and then came up with ideas around these. So at this point, we had kind of walls full of ideas, some of them big, some of them small. And then what we did is we kind of clustered those into what became 7 concept areas. So the first one we had is the idea of a national environmental data hub. We also have the idea of automated screening and assisted scoping. We've got the digital EIA workspace and impact modeling, the interactive and accessible environmental statement, and also post-application monitoring. And you can see more about this in our report, but this diagram shows a simplified version of the existing kind of process map. And underneath, you can see where each of these concepts fits within that process. As you can see, the data hub, for example, fits across the whole process, but automated screening is just at the beginning, really. And so we held further interviews with stakeholders, made adjustments and gained ideas of which out of these 7 concepts, which ones seemed the most crucial. And based on what we heard, as well as an understanding of what was already being worked on across the industry, we chose 3 concepts to work on more closely. And that's the National Environmental Data Hub, the Digital EIA workspace, and post-application monitoring. Now, that's not to say that the other ones aren't important. We still believe that kind of they're all important together, but we had to kind of prioritize 3 to work on. It's worth saying that this is a discovery project, and so they are high-level concepts. We're not precious. We're willing to be told that we're wrong, but what we start with here won't be what we end up with, and we're sure of that. There's still a lot of consideration and research to be made. So what we did next is synthesize more stakeholder feedback, and we developed more detailed user interface screens for each of them. So I'll walk through each of them now quickly. So first, we have the National Environmental Data Hub. This was seen as the most transformational concept by participants in our interviews. It would make it easier to find, use, and standardize data sets, and it would also give greater transparency to the process. There's also opportunities within this for SMEs to develop new tools and innovations from the data as well. And we've also explored various business models around this idea to think about how you might incentivize organizations to share their data. Here's an example of one of the mock-up screens. You can see more of the mock-up screens and more details around them in the report. But on this one, for example, you can easily search for and filter data, either in a list view or map view. We thought it was important to make sure that metadata and timestamps were included, and also the idea of user-generated ratings to understand the reliability of data. And also that you might be able to scroll through a timeline to see how that data has changed over time. And we also worked on the Digital EIA workspace. We heard that this idea is already starting to happen in some areas of the industry. And so we thought it was kind of important to try and imagine what kind of a standardized version of it might be. But it provides transparency and it promotes collaboration. It standardizes methods of reporting to reduce the obesity that we mentioned. And it also has the ability to reduce time spent tracking changes and consolidating comments. And again, with the screens, we've got numerous screens to see in the report, but for this one, as an example, you could, it can work in a similar way to a good website CMS, has the ability to create and add plugins, which is another potential marketplace for SMEs and innovation. The data stays live. It's not turned into a JPEG or a PDF. But also we've got a few nice little ideas in there, like jargon busters and word limit recommendations. or even pre-populated text for information like legislation that often appears numerous times within a report or across all reports. And then we go into post-application monitoring. The idea of this is that it creates a feedback loop that helps us to understand the actual impact of a development. Data, processes, policy, and regulations will be improved through the feedback. And this was seen as impactful in promoting transparency and accountability of predictions and creating new data outlining the success of mitigation strategies. We did find out, though, that the kind of defining responsibilities for monitoring ownership and reporting of monitoring data is still crucial for an integral part of this process. Now, the idea of this, it wasn't as simple as creating some kind of UX screens. There's kind of a lot more to it. So what we've done is we've considered 3 ways in which you might encourage, collect, and utilize post-application data. Now, they're only examples. We know that there's kind of lots of other ways, but here's some that we explored. So the first one, to encourage monitoring, is the idea of accreditations and certifications. They're already being used across the construction industry to incentivize particular behaviors. So we think that kind of having an official accreditation or like a mark of recognition for continuing to monitor the developments would be kind of a good way to encourage the stakeholders. Collecting monitoring data, we kind of looked into the idea of citizen science. So whilst it wouldn't be the only way to collect data for monitoring, the practice of public participation and collaboration in scientific research to increase scientific knowledge is a quick and effective way to collect large amounts of data whilst encouraging transparency and public engagement, whether that's with individual members of the public or like public groups. And then here we do have a screen, which is just the idea of a dashboard for local authorities who might use site-specific monitoring data to see the status of a development after it's been completed or even during its creation. And it could link to a wider city monitoring dashboard as well. For each of the prioritized concepts, we've created some high-level roadmaps which suggest what might need to happen next to make these happen. So you can read a little bit more detail of those in the report. So before I finish, it's really important that we say a massive thank you to all of those who contributed to our work, those who took part in interviews and workshops, some of them more than once. We really appreciate kind of all of the effort that you guys contributed. So as I mentioned, you can read the full report at this website. But also, we're looking to continue this project further. So definitely get in touch if you'd like to get involved. And that's it from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Liam. Sorry, my Zoom cut out for a second then. Thanks, Liam, for that. And we really would encourage people, these are just our ideas and our thoughts from our collaboration. We were due to launch them at an event which some of you would have registered for, but was cancelled due to COVID. We'd really encourage you to get in touch through the PlanTech email if you want to engage further or you've got any other comments. One quick reminder before we go on to our next speaker. When you ask questions through the Q&A function, if you want to direct them towards a specific speaker, if you could add this, that would be great. So next we're on to Pauline, who's going to talk about the approach that Scottish renewables are taking. I'm just going to remind Liam to turn his camera off and Pauline to turn his camera on.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Pauline Andrew from Scottish Power Renewables. I'm going today to start by introducing myself very briefly, then talk about what we've done at Scottish Power Renewables and what we are doing right now. And then I'll insist a bit more on what we see are the main challenges and opportunities of digital EIA in our world. Next slide, please. So I'm a French engineer. I've worked in Taiwan, Denmark, and now Scotland on the energy projects. more specifically floating solar development, onshore wind and offshore wind. I was also product owner and IT support at Lautech in Denmark. So I have both technical engineering and project management background and IT background, which leads me today to be assistant project manager and part of the Digital EIA team in the offshore wind development department of Scottish Power Renewables. Next slide, please. So what we've done so far at Scottish Power Renewables. The idea of Digital EIA is not new. It's something that we wanted to do on East Anglia 1 North, which is one of our wind farms that's now at examination phase. However, we didn't have enough time to implement the whole Digital EIA process, so we just went with the classic paper application. So the Digital EIA project was reborn last year, and we've conducted an extensive market review looking at what has been done in terms of digital, looking especially at projects like Crossrail, A303, the Cross-Day Link scoping report that are all, or at least to some extent, digital. Then we conducted a lot of interviews, and we realized that a lot of potential providers of Digital EIA had given quite a lot of thoughts, and a lot of them had already started working and defining their own version of what Digital EIA would be like, although there was not necessarily a developer to push the project forward. So overall, all of them, I would say, were very excited that at last a developer was ready to take the step towards Digital EIA. So yes, at last is an expression that we heard a few times during the interviews. So since then, we've appointed a strategy advisor to help us define the strategy of how to implement Digital EIA before we procure the actual Digital EIA piece of work. And last but not least, we've also gotten a legal opinion on Digital EIA, and we looked at what the legislation says about digital document copies. These are words that come back all the time and have a definition that may or may not allow the use of digital. This legal opinion was given towards what's relevant to offshore wind. And we looked at all regimes, all regimes, the English, Welsh and Scottish regimes. And we also did a bit of stakeholder interaction to mention the topic to some stakeholders to see what their point of view was towards the use of digital. Next slide, please. So what are we doing now? Now we are defining our requirements. As a client, some would say developer, we need to make very clear what our strategy, what is it we're trying to achieve with digital. And we want to get in the position to define the scope of work that we are going to put in place for both the digital integrator and the EIA consultants that we want to contract for our new upcoming offshore wind projects. So our definition of requirements is something that we do together with our strategy consultant that we've appointed, is around several topics that you see on the screen: commercial, contractual, cultural, technical, and regulatory. Then we're also still doing the legal review, taking to the next step, which is to see what is allowed under the current legislation. How much could we do under the legislation as it stands today? and on the other side, where the legislation would need to be updated to allow for the use of digital. And last but not least, the stakeholder onboarding. That's something that we want to do. We haven't exactly started yet, but we are defining our strategy on how to engage early with our stakeholders. That it's something that as many people as possible agree on and is discussed, and not something that we push to people without having consulted them beforehand. Next slide, please. So what came out of these activities? What we think are the main challenges? I would say if I had to pick one, I would say the first one, that the legislation is restrictive. The legislation in the UK was written for paper-based application. So we have undertaken the initial review, as I said, trying to identify where there is scope for us to work with the stakeholders. The idea is that we want to find areas where we can have a discussion with the stakeholders to make sure that they're happy to receive digital copies, and also identify where an update of the legislation would be needed, and then how to move forward from there, who should push for it, and with which timeline. What is sure is that whatever we do, we will have to be compliant with the legislation, obviously. So we're not going to do anything where there is space for anyone to oppose to the project, saying that we are not compliant with the legislation. So either we find a way to be compliant, or the legislation will have to be updated. Then another point is that all this is new. Digital EIA hasn't really been done in the sense that no big infrastructure project has been consented from a digital EIA. So we have to define new ways of working together, and this implies that we have stakeholder support and also a full working contractual approach, because it's not the way we're working today. So maybe you noticed that I used the word integrator on the previous slide. This is terminology that comes from Project 13, and I would definitely encourage you to have a look at this if you're interested. It's the idea that the digital role is, well, the way we would apply it is that the digital role would be central to the EIA practitioners and developer. So the implementation of digital EIA would require new skill sets, and there would be training needed with associated costs. And so all this way of working together, as I was saying, needs a new contractual approach that we're trying to define. The technical challenges, I'm not really going to cover these. Our consultants would say that with time and money, anything is doable. So it's about being reasonable on how much investment we want to cover ourselves. Timeline is an interesting one, because the timeline we have to define is we have to make fit the development timeline for our new projects, the implementation of digital EIA, and the timeline for legislation compliance, being either legislation review or update. So timeline is going to be key. As a developer, we want to develop projects. We're not updating the legislation, is not our core activity. Then the last one is costs. So far, the cost of developing digital EIA is unknown. So that's definitely a challenge and something we'll have to define. And I would also add that digital EIA can be seen as a commercial risk for us. Once again, we have to be compliant with the legislation. So right now, we are putting a lot of effort into defining what digital EIA is. But if by the end of the year, we don't have visibility on the viability of transferring to a digital way of working, then we would have to park Digital EIA for a while, because our development projects have to move on, and digital has to be ready by the end of the year. Now the opportunities, because there are also lots of opportunities. As a developer, I would say that the biggest opportunity is to have better consultation, enhanced consultation, by having better accessibility of the information, transparency of the information, and help people to use the report, because the way the EIA reports or environmental statements are written today, it makes it very hard for people to cross-reference between different chapters, for example. This would be much easier with an online interactive, something that would look like a website. So this is definitely a main driver, is to enhance the consultation. Then more streamlined EIA process. The move towards digital EIA would bring more consistency in presentation, especially if we think from the point of view of a developer of having multiple projects. If we could have something that's consistent in terms of how we communicate with our contractors and then to all our consultees, that would be extremely helpful. And then consistency in the processes. For example, digital EIA would make track changes a lot easier. So that would be a real benefit for us. Another point is the printing costs reduction, especially on the long term. And I'm not only talking about the pallets of EIA documents for submission, but also all the reviewing process when we're sending paper copies back and forth. So there is an opportunity for cost reductions in printing, which would lead in itself to a more sustainable approach. And I would conclude saying that there are clear benefits and opportunities with digital EIA if we see it as an industry-wide change, not something only project-based by one developer changing the way they are working, but really an industry-wide change. And there's a chance for all the stakeholders to get on board and train their staff where needed, if it's really a change that comes from different parts of the business. So I hope that there will be more events like this, and I want to thank Catapult for having me today. It's a great opportunity for this onboarding and communicating this idea of digital EIA. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions after and by email if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline. Thanks for that. We were really pleased that Pauline reached out to us as part of our research. And you did it again in that presentation. Thanks for being so honest about, as well as the opportunities and the way you're showcasing some of the challenges you face, because I think there's a lot for others to learn from them. So next up, we've got Alistair, who's going to be talking to us a bit about the work of Open Systems Lab. So I will pass over to Alistair now.
Thanks, Kate. And let me do the share screening thing, and we'll see if this works. Good afternoon, everyone. First question is that working? Can everyone see that? Good, hope so. You'll scream if you don't, otherwise. So I wanted to, really what I thought I'd just talk about is give a kind of general overview about really why this matters, in the bigger scheme of things, why we should care about digitization of planning, particularly with reference to the work we're doing from a different part of the spectrum. And I thought a good place to start with that is a quote from one of my heroes, the law professor at Harvard, Larry Lessig, who said, if you want to understand society, don't look at what's argued about, but what's taken for granted. Now, what's quite interesting about this is it's pretty much universally accepted that the planning system is, variously described as broken, dysfunctional, Byzantine, and so on. But what's interesting is that by and large, that tends to gravitate towards arguments about planning policy, or even the principle of having a planning system itself, right? And basically the kind of starting point for this mode of exploration is to say, well, wait a minute, what if actually, sure, there might be lots and lots of ways we need to improve and change planning policy in the 21st century, but actually, what if 80% of the problems actually are about redesigning planning process, and innovation in planning process, not necessarily innovation in planning policy or principle. That matters, by the way, because if those of us who would defend the importance of a planning system fail to innovate to make sure that planning processes actually work, then of course we leave the door open to those who would use the dysfunctionality of obsolete systems to attack them and to dismantle policy and principle of the planning system, when actually all we needed to change was process. So I think we should be quite radical, because quite a lot is at stake. So the basic problem, of course, as we all know, with the planning system is that it was designed in 1948, well, a bit before then. Basically, it was designed to run on an operating system that was paper, that was documents. And this has some pretty obvious problems with it, because by definition, documents can only be written by humans and read by other humans. So that means every single document has to be laboriously read through, checked, sent back. You have to dig through policy, you have to learn it, then you have to, and so on and so forth. So huge amounts of work goes into this. The other one is errors and omissions. And one of the things we've found since we started our work in this space is invalidations. So across the UK, we're finding that on average, at least 50% of all planning applications that are submitted to planning authorities are invalid. So there's nothing to do with the content of the application. It's just about the information being present and correct. And this is costing councils, the taxpayer, and businesses many millions of pounds every year, just because people make mistakes and miss and forget documents they're needed and so forth. Redundant information, this is a kind of huge one. Anecdotally, you hear from planners all the time. They'll say, well, we get these reports, but 80% of it is our own policy stuff regurged back. And we have to kind of pick through it to find the actual important, pertinent pieces of data that are actually going to shape the decision. Obviously, as I've already mentioned, the issue of poor standardization. And poor standardization is a political issue, right? Because if you can't compare stuff, because if all information has to be manually prepared, then planning is by definition a partial system. Consultants work for one side or another and so forth, right? So by definition, standardization, lack of standardization leaves room for lack of trust. That can even go down to how many significant figures are being used in a piece of data. And of course, then lack of data, which particularly Liam touched on, was the fact that we just don't have monitoring data, and we just don't, we can't collect and see this stuff because it's all just hidden, buried away in documents. And then there's the flip side of this, which is self-evidently this system is incredibly opaque and incredibly inaccessible. Like, if you don't have the means or resources, the time or the knowledge or the skill to dig through huge mountains of documents, then the planning system is shut to you. Meaningful participation, at least, is shut to you. So there is this kind of structural undemocracy hidden at the heart of our planning processes. And another interesting effect of this, which I think, that we don't talk about so much, is the way that this can narrow the discourse around planning. So it prevents us having holistic conversations. So there's many factors, from environmental aspects, transport aspects, that go into deciding a planning scheme. And yet, how often have we been in planning committees where the whole conversation gets hijacked and bandwagoned by the issue of, say, car parking? Because human beings only have a certain amount of bandwidth. So they tend to focus on, the part that's at conflict, rather than other stuff could be happening in the background that we don't see. So obviously, there's this shift to saying, well, what if we can change the operating system behind the planning system, which is to run on data in the web instead of running on exchanging electronic documents back and forth. Benefits are probably pretty obvious because they're all the antithesis of the problems. First, taking away, just automating a huge amount of that admin and document management and handling stuff, which is work that really nobody wants to be doing, and mistakes that really nobody wants to be making. So we should be getting invalidations very, very close to zero in any sensible system. Another really huge benefit of this, which I'll come back to in a moment, is the ability to focus on relevant content. We often use the phrase "allow planners to plan," rather than all their time being mired up in all this other procedural stuff. But relevant content is actually really, really important. I'll explain. I'll just kind of show that why I think that's important in a minute. Again, the counterpoint to what I said before, the importance of standards is that they're actually setting a benchmark, a neutrality that can be therefore can have gateways onto these from all the different stakeholders involved in the process, including communities, wildlife groups, citizen science, as well as developers, as well as local authorities. And of course, the ability to then use this information meaningfully without having to go and do a PhD, basically, right? Because we can make computer programs and people can build all sorts of amazing stuff on top of this data, which can actually then allow us to rapidly and instantaneously see insights into the likely impact of a scheme that would otherwise take thousands of pounds worth of study, and that just wouldn't happen. And again, touching on this before, to get feedback and actually to, instead of reinventing the wheel every single time, to get reusable data and patterns. So we're kind of playing with this at the very far end, at the other end in some ways in the scale. So, we're working on a project with Lambeth Council and a bunch of other councils, which is we're to develop a digital planning application service where as much as possible and this is actually starting very much at householder scale applications, where as much as possible of the information is being asked for as structured data instead of documents. And this has, a bunch of unexpected benefits. Like the ostensible main objective of this project is to dramatically reduce the number of invalid planning applications, which are coming through to councils. But actually, from a user's point of view, it has loads and loads of benefits. I should say this is a kind of one of many slides of this interesting exercise of reverse engineering many of the kind of documents, the forms and reports and documents that go into most planning applications, some of which have more or less standardized structures, some of them that have more or less, there might be an ISO standard or something about it. But the other benefits of this, there's loads of other unexpected spin-out benefits. One is that you no longer need to structure all planning discourse around these really esoteric sounding documents, because of course data can be sorted in any way you want. So the ability to actually organize information about planning in a much more sort of intuitive, coherent way, particularly for users and members of the public. And this is the thing I was touching on before about sort of dynamic, using dynamic engines to focus only on information that's relevant, right? Because a huge amount of information. So what we can do is we can only ask for information, or ask for information that is deemed to be relevant based on the information that's already available, right? So we can actually focus really on the stuff that matters. So ironically, actually, if we start shifting towards these systems, if you want to, planning regulation can be far more dense and complex, actually, because the experience of it is orders of magnitude simpler. And that's definitely something that we're beginning to see with this work that we're doing on a digital planning applications. Because although actually when we kind of broke down a householder planning application and ended up with something like, I think it's something about 270 separate pieces of data, most planning applications only have to actually provide a fraction of those, if once they know that whether or not they're which planning constraints apply to them and so forth. And so we can do really cool stuff with it once you've taken this approach, such as this. So this is the first PlanX thing, which is allows you to rapidly go out and find out if your project needs planning permission in about 2 minutes. And of course, in the future, there'll be lots of, we'll be able to extend this much further. It has really interesting implications for almost in a way challenging back to policy teams and saying, well, actually, can we write more specific policy about the actual outcomes we want? An awful lot of policy is very fuzzy. I think probably a lot of you will know, you sort of say, has this been considered? Well, what's that mean? So, but actually the ability to write policy that's actually much more direct and transparent about the actual outcomes and trade-offs that we'd like to see is a win for everybody, because it means that actually that transparency feeds back to the public, but it also feeds back to developers. And so they can actually start responding to natural constraints or legal constraints much before they start designing, instead of halfway through or right at the end and there's a massive legal bun fight. But to finish, I just want to kind of finish with a couple of sort of zoom out points that I just think are worth, sort of takeaways really, that I think are worth reflecting on. So one is these sorts of data standards and these sorts of things, and I think this is really beautifully reflected in the framing of a workspace, is that you cannot ever finish them. As I said, planning is a contested thing. So actually data standards are political. So actually they need to be continually evolving, and they need to be out in the open for everybody to interrogate and to be continually learning and getting smarter, so that we can build a community around them that's making them better. Yeah, and as I said, there's a question of data standard, is it something you can finish? Even in some cases, if it's something you can finish, it probably shouldn't be something you would finish, because that's democratic discourse. And the final one, which is kind of boring but really, really important, is that all of this is only possible if the pieces of software on both the private and the public sector side that we're using are open and data interoperable. That this data can actually move from machine to machine. And of course, as we know, a lot of the legacy bits of software, that's not true of, for technical and commercial reasons. And so I think that this is the kind of underlying ground condition, is that when we talk about plan tech, we imagine these really fantastic visualization platforms and all the extraordinary interfaces that you could do. But the reality is that that's only possible if we've sort of sweated the boring stuff of actually coming together and working out how to communicate planning information as data, and then made sure that that data can flow freely between every single part of the ecosystem. And with that, I will shut up.
Thank you, Alistair. If all panelists could just come back on the screen. And thanks to Alistair. I think one of the really important takeaways from that actually is how taking that approach can actually make policy more direct and transparent for those that use it, which has benefits for users and local authorities. I'm conscious that we've only got about just under 10 minutes for question and answer. I know all the audience, because of new Zoom security procedures, can't see all the questions, but I can see a lot of them are for us at CPC. So we will definitely commit after this to doing a Q&A answer response, and we'll reach out to the other speakers to pick up theirs after this as well, and then we'll issue a document to all attendees. But Dominica is going to try and pick up as many as possible. If you're back on, Dominica, I can't see your camera or your microphone.
I have my camera on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we wanted to avoid this kind of speaking from the void, but weirdly my camera seems not to be working, so apologies for this. Okay, so I know that we, like it said, won't be able to answer all of them, but the first question would be to Liam, and it is, would you consider a learning management system rather than a CMS as another route for the National Data Hub?
So I think that these kind of details are kind of like maybe part of the next step in terms of identifying the types of software or kind of processes that we might use to create that. But actually, like having a quick look at the idea of learning management systems, it certainly seems more appropriate because that would give users a more kind of active role and kind of a less, not as much of a passive role. So, yeah,
and regarding the data hub, Who did the project team think should own and administer this?
Yeah, so there was kind of a lot of back and forth on that actually. In the interviews, there was kind of a lot of different opinions on that. I think the central government were seen at least as kind of key partners for delivering it, whether it was them that owned it or not, but it kind of certainly needed to come from them. Or it might be that there's also kind of research institutions as well that we heard could be a good idea. We do need to explore kind of the business model ideas a bit further on that. But also, I think it was in that question they mentioned about the costs of it as well, or the kind of that kind of thing. And so one thing that I didn't mention, but it is in our report, is we talked about the idea of it being a distributed access model rather than one place that stores all of the data for everyone. It's more of a portal where you can access data that's hosted in other places, basically. So that would hopefully take the complexity and the cost of it down quite heavily.
Thank you. And then a question for Alistair from Quod. What are your views on requirements for publishing post-construction monitoring and updated impact assessment? And should this become a consent condition?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. At the moment, monitoring is really only done when it is a planning condition. I think majority of developers, it's fair to say, don't carry it out. A number of reasons behind that. Extra costs that maybe they don't want to do. They don't maybe see the benefits that could be found in the data themselves to learn what mitigation measures have worked and what can be taken forwards into other developments. And I think there's a slight concern for them that it may come back with bad results, adverse results that are worse than predictions. So therefore, there may be more cost put on them to rectify that. It's not a likely scenario, but something that could happen. So while the onus would be on developers naturally to look into this aspect of things, they only generally do it for compliance purposes. I think if it was changed and due course regulation was updated maybe, and it became more of a common thing, a lot of those fears would drop away because there'd be a lot of effort earlier on in the sort of design phase to make sure that there won't be adverse effects, and then monitoring could become much more beneficial generally. It could lead into the data hub, and that could be recycled and used by many other parties and agents. Public data could become more prevalent in terms of recording data and things like that to be more useful. So I think it's more of a cultural shift that would happen that has to be done probably through regulation, top-down approach.
Pauline, considering that legislation is, in your opinion, the greatest challenge, how much appetite do you think there is for legislative change, and what legislation do you feel impedes the use of digital EIA?
So appetite for change, I would say none. No one wants to tackle changing the legislation. However, if it has to be done, well, that's the road to take. So I would say, yeah, legislation update is a last resort if it's needed for us to be compliant. But we will try first to do all we can to make everyone agree that digital EIA is the way to go, and that it is a way to, there's a way to make it compliant with the existing legislation. So what legislation poses problem? And all the relevant pieces of legislation, so mostly the infrastructure planning EIA regulations, there's mention of documents or hard copies, printed copies, and at different degrees, sometimes with the possibility to get an agreement from the stakeholders on whether they need a printed copy or not, and sometimes completely mandatory, depending on the Scottish regime, English regime, etc. So there are lots of different cases, and I'm in no way a lawyer, but yes, so I think that's our take on the legislation. I think there was a third part to your question.
Yes, I will just jump to another question just so we have everybody kind of give an input, and then we might come back to it later or in a blog. But Alistair from Open Systems, do you see the current acquisition of digital skills and online planning committees will help this to jump forward through raised public expectations?
It's a very good question, this, because I feel like, and we've talked quite a lot about this, that I feel like you'd like to think that particularly the current crisis, will sort of drive a sudden surge forward towards bringing the planning system kicking and screaming into the 21st century. Oddly enough, the actual pattern, I think what we've seen is actually it drives widespread adoption of technologies that have already been around, particularly video conferencing. And so we've seen that thing of getting planning committees happening online, et cetera, et cetera. And I suspect some elements of that will be here to stay. And they definitely are, frankly, catching up with probably where people's expectations already were. And of course, none of us are getting any younger. So the generations coming through, every time we go and buy car insurance, we do it online, right? It's a data-driven service. So it's going to become more and more weird that, anything across planning. So it isn't digital. So although like this, I think this, recent events, I think it definitely is going to make people realize this isn't just a kind of fun thing that we do for a laugh. Like, digital innovation is actually quite serious in terms of building resilient government. I don't think necessarily that's what will necessarily drive public opinion. I think probably public expectations are already going in that direction anyway.
Thank you. And I think we have a time for maybe one more question, and it will be to you, Pauline. So in the development of the Digital EIA approach, is this a sole venture from Scottish Power as an in-house approach, or are you going to explore commercial models such as working with a software developer to commercialize this so others can use it?
So the Digital EIA initiative comes from the Offshore Wind Development Department, and it's a highly competitive business. So we would like the industry to make a move towards digital. We are in no way trying to be the only developer to move to digital. That would work against us. So we're not protecting the concept of Digital EIA in any way. However, because it's so highly competitive, it's going to be difficult to co-develop something with such strategic and confidential information. What could work is what you're presenting is the common database. That is completely fine, but then the development of the system is so interlinked with our own processes that so far it's not something we've considered, but we're, I would say, open to discussions.
Thank you very much. And we unfortunately don't have any more times for questions, and I'll pass this to Kate. We will hope to answer some of your questions after this webinar, but Kate will explain.
Because we've just got 1 minute left, I'm going to be naughty actually, and our events team might hit me, but just ask Alistair and Pauline one question and to give a one-line answer to, which is just to close, what one action do you think needs to be taken and who should take it to unlock the opportunities of Digital EIA? And just one-line answers. If we go to Alistair Parvin first.
Really simple and really boring. Change procurement, fund local councils to do digital transformation and change their procurement models.
Thank you. Alistair Walker?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it needs to be done. I think simply enough, though, it's top level driven, so changing legislation will free up a lot of innovation.
Cool. And Pauline?
I would say engage with all the stakeholders that have a part to play in the EIA process to educate on the benefits of Digital EIA so that it's an industry-wide change and not just the action of one developer here and whoever on another side.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think it's just all really good food for thought to leave everyone with. So thanks everyone. Thank you. A huge thanks to all the speakers for joining us today. It was really interesting to hear your perspectives on the challenges and opportunities in this sector. one on the 22nd of May around enabling unmanned traffic management systems. 17th of June, a virtual connections cafe, which is all about supporting and networking. And just to note, the one on the 18th of June will be at a revised and special time of 10 a.m. because we'll actually be having speakers from Singapore. And you can just visit our website to register. So again, a huge thanks to all our speakers, a really interesting event. So thank you again, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.